Hello history fans, welcome back to another episode of Women in History Rambles, and today I want to talk about Queen Lady Jane Grey because yes, we should call her Queen, and the amount of Tudor monarchs books that don't include her is really sad, so this is an overview of her story. I hope you enjoy. I'm going to try and keep it in a timeline format as well so it's a bit more helpful or clear. So she's born in 1536, the exact day or date is unknown, but she is the eldest of three daughters. Her father, Henry Grey, was the third Marquess of Dorset and he is an academic. And her mother, Lady Frances Brandon, was the daughter of Mary, who is the sister of King Henry VIII, so her royal lineage comes from her mother. She's born near Leicester and is well educated to fit her status, and she learnt religious reform and Protestantism, and it's said that she really enjoyed her education and could speak up to 8 languages. We know about her education and enthusiasm because unusually in a time where women aren't really written about in historians' narrative, people made a point of telling us about her academic ability and intelligence. And her tutor was also the tutor of Elizabeth I, who's another woman known for her brains, and he wrote of her academic ability as well and said that Jane was actually the smarter of the two. In February of 1547, King Edward's uncle Thomas Seymour bought her wardship as he recognised her importance as equal to Mary and Elizabeth, so she moves from Bradgate Part and goes to live in Seymour Place in London. And then Thomas Seymour marries Catherine Parr. So Jane spends a lot of time with her as well, which would have been brilliant for Jane because, as we know, Catherine Parr was an advocate for women's education and religious reform. But sadly, at just 12 years old, Jane is then chief mourner at Catherine's funeral, so she moves back home to her parents. She does start to neglect her studies and apparently spends far too much time on music, so Bullinger, who is a Protestant theologian, starts to write to her and he has a huge impact on her, so she begins to model herself the same as Elizabeth, as a pious Protestant. During 1549 she's just quietly going about carrying on with her life, but then in 1551 her father is created the Duke of Suffolk, so her family relocates to Sheen in London. But then sadly in April 1552 we begin to see the demise of her cousin Edward as he gets measles and smallpox, but he does then recover only to start getting ill again a year later. On the 25th of May 1552 she marries Guildford Dudley after her father is convinced to buy Northumberland, but her mother is not happy with the marriage because she expected a much more advantageous marriage for her daughter, if not the king himself. Sadly, the king is too ill to go to the wedding, but he does send wedding clothes and gifts, and also a lot of people at the wedding get food poisoning. And Jane is also not happy about the marriage, but she recognises her duty. Now, Henry VIII's will tells us that Edward was his successor. If Edward had no heirs, it then goes to Mary and Elizabeth, even though they were technically illegitimate. If his children had no heirs, it then goes to his sister Mary. Now, logically, it should then go to her daughter Frances, but Henry leaves her out because he doesn't really like her husband, so it jumps from Mary to Jane. So her claim is set up by her uncle Henry, it's just no one expects it to ever even get that far down. When Edward starts to get ill again in the spring of 1553, he decides to write a plan or device for succession. He cuts Mary out because she's a Catholic and she will undo all of his good work, so to be fair he has to cut out Elizabeth as well, obviously, and he then says that the succession goes to Jane's heir male. But he then realises he's not going to live long enough for that to happen, so he edits and adds in the word "and", so his will now reads that the succession goes to Lady Jane Grey and her heirs male. So again, the king has laid out her path to succession and the people should recognise her claim to the throne and she should be supported by the council. On the 6th of July 1553, King Edward VI dies, unmarried at the age of 15 with no heir. So the officers of state sign his will saying that Jane is now successor. Jane is then taken to Northumberland's house where she's told she's now heir, and she is of course distraught, not only by the grief of losing her cousin, but by this enormous role that has just now been thrown upon her. But as we suspect, she is a very strong, powerful woman who is determined to do her duty, fulfill her role, and she's going to make the best of the situation and continue Edward's good work. Now, this is where everyone can start debating in the comments, because she's not just the 9-day queen, she's the 13-day queen, because she became queen on the day Edward died. That's the 6th of July, because she was written in as his successor. Just like, I suppose, Charles became our king the day the queen died, and he's proclaimed king in like May, isn't he? But he is our king already. So really, Jane was queen for 13 days. But most people do date her queenship to the 10th of July 1553, because that was when she was publicly proclaimed queen. So she was queen privately for 4 days beforehand. During those 13 days, she does assert herself and her power, and she isn't just a puppet for everyone most of the time. It's suggested that Northumberland thought she was going to be easy to control, and that's why he sort of helped her get power, I suppose. But she's not, and she refuses to bow to his commands, and she does not make her husband king, which is what Northumberland wanted. On the 10th of July, she arrives at the Tower of London ready for her proclamation, but she receives a letter from Mary saying that she is not giving up her claim to the throne. So Jane issues a proclamation calling her people to rally behind her and support her. But it's not hugely successful because people have started to want Mary instead. On the 18th of July, we have a letter written by her talking about her claim and her right to the throne, signed Jane Queen. And we also have a signing for a delivery of jewels where she signs it Jane the Queen. But later, Queen is scrubbed out because people now wanted to make it clear that they didn't support her claim. So maybe her reign was doomed from the start. Even though the king had laid out her succession, the people wanted Mary. But Mary had nearly left the country because she thought she was going to be the one that was in trouble, until the 10th of July, when the people started to support her instead. Even though Mary had the more legitimate claim to the throne through Edward's device, it wasn't ever officially pushed through Parliament. But she was still recognised by the council. So Jane is now staying in the Tower of London, where she had gone for her proclamation, but she's now staying there until her trial, which happened on the 13th of November 1553, alongside her husband and Thomas Seymour's, I believe. Cranmer recorded and wrote her trial transcript in Latin that's now at the National Archives, and they tell us that she was just a teenage girl standing trial for treason. She walked the mile from the Tower to Guildhall, and she pleaded guilty, meaning that she became the youngest royal woman to be condemned for treason. But she believed that the trial was just a formality because Mary had made it clear she was going to show mercy. But the story now takes another big turn, and 4 months later, Jane is executed. Mary did want to pardon Jane. She was Francis's godmother, so she grew up visiting Jane and they had a close relationship, but ultimately she was forced and she didn't really have a choice because of a few different things. Firstly, she knew that Jane was forced into the situation, but she recognised that justice was needed to be shown. But then Henry Grey, her idiot father, decides to be a key conspirator in the Wyatt Rebellion, which took up arms against Mary's intended marriage to the King of Spain. And Mary's already shown him mercy by releasing him from prison after Jane's trial. So he's blown his second chance. And even though Jane has absolutely no involvement in this rebellion, the Imperial Ambassador now demands her execution. So the execution comes as a huge shock to Jane because Mary had shown her intentions of just leaving her be, even though she was condemned. Jane decides she's going to die a Protestant martyr, even though Mary tries her best to save her soul by converting her to Catholicism. So much so that on the 8th of February 1554, she sends a Catholic chaplain to her to try and convert her. But Jane debates with him, and he's so impressed by her determined spirit that he agrees to go along with her on the execution day anyway. It is now the 10th of February 1554. At 10 a.m, Jane watches her husband being taken to execution and then sees his remains brought back to the chapel. She reads from her prayer book while she walks and then steps up onto the scaffolding and says, "Good people, I am come hither to die, and by a law I am condemned the same. and she's very calm and composed until she's blindfolded. At this point she realises that the block isn't within reach, and she desperately panics and cries out, "Where is it? What do I do?" And it's this really tragic, desperate moment that we see in Paul Delaroche's artwork. But her hands are guided to the block, she lays her head down, and one swing of the axe does it, and that's the end of her story. Sadly, we don't have any portraits that we know are definitely of her, as there's just no evidence that any of them are her, and contemporary writings don't give us any descriptions either. Obviously, Paul Delaroche's artwork in 1833 is probably the most famous depiction we have of her, because it shows that heartbreaking moment of the end of her story, but that's not what she looked like either, which is really sad. She is definitely worthy of being remembered and recognised for her academic ability and her strong spirit, and not just a tragic victim of women's history. So I really hope this video has given you a little bit of insight into her story and why we should remember her as such a strong queen, even if it was very short-lived. I hope you enjoyed, and thank you all very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and all that jazz, and I'll see you soon. It might even be for Halloween week. We'll see.